a powerful voice in the pulpit, silenced. A bishop once admired across the nation, now standing at the center of a storm that could shake the very foundation of modern ministry. Bishop Charles H. Ellis III wasn't just another preacher. He was a legacy, a symbol of Detroit's spiritual power, a man who carried the weight of a name that built one of America's most influential churches. But what happens when the man who seemed untouchable becomes the subject of whispers, leaked confessions, and public outrage? Today, we're diving deep into the rise and downfall of Bishop Charles Ellis, from the glory days of Greater Grace Temple to the confessions that have stunned the faith community. Was this a man caught in a web of misunderstanding, or a leader finally facing the consequences of secrets long hidden behind stained glass walls? Stay with me, because what's coming next might just change the way you see church leadership forever. Before the controversy, before the headlines, there was a man who seemed destined for greatness. Bishop Charles H. Ellis III wasn't born into the pulpit by accident. He was born into a legacy. His father, the late Bishop David L. Ellis Sr., founded Greater Grace Temple in Detroit, Michigan, a powerhouse of faith, influence, and community leadership. When Bishop David passed away in 1996, the mantle didn't just fall to his son, it was expected to. All eyes turned to Charles. Would he rise to the occasion, or would the legacy crumble under the weight of expectation? And rise he did, at least at first. Under his leadership, Greater Grace Temple transformed from a thriving congregation into a global brand of faith. Thousands filled the pews every Sunday. The church's television ministry reached homes nationwide. Greater Grace hosted funerals for cultural icons, civic events, and worship services that felt more like red carpet experiences than traditional Sunday mornings. Celebrities, politicians, and business leaders packed the front rows, eager to be seen in the glow of Detroit's most charismatic preacher. Bishop Ellis wasn't just a pastor, he was a performer. His sermons were powerful, his presence magnetic. Dressed sharply, speaking smoothly, he brought energy, emotion, and eloquence to every message. For many, he embodied what modern church leadership could look like: stylish, relevant, confident. And when he became the presiding bishop of the Pentecostal assemblies of the world, overseeing more than 1.5 million members globally, his influence reached historic heights. But with that influence came something else: attention. His success brought both admiration and envy. Supporters saw a man walking boldly in divine favor. Critics, however, began to whisper that the ministry's focus had shifted from serving the people to serving the image. Private jets, luxury cars, designer suits, promotional videos that looked more like music videos than church announcements. Some said he was setting a new standard of excellence for ministry. Others wondered if something sacred was slowly being lost in the shine. And as his fame grew, so did the distance between Bishop Ellis and the very flock he was called to shepherd. Because what started as admiration was about to turn into suspicion. But this was only the beginning. The whispers behind the pews were growing louder, and soon they would break into the open. At first, it was nothing more than murmurs. Quiet conversations exchanged between trusted members in the pews, subtle glances during board meetings, uneasy silences in the choir room. But as time passed, those whispers began to echo louder, spreading through Greater Grace Temple like a storm rolling in from the distance. Something was changing, and not just in the spirit of the church. Under Bishop Ellis's leadership, the ministry had become a machine. Every service was polished, every sermon broadcast, every move carefully branded. What once felt sacred began to feel staged. Longtime members, especially those who had worshipped under his father's humble leadership, started noticing the shift. The altar calls felt rehearsed. The prayer sessions turned into productions. Offerings were collected with more urgency, and the focus on presentation began to outshine the message. To some, it was excellence. To others, it was ego. Behind closed doors, staff turnover became noticeable. Associate pastors resigned quietly. Choir directors stepped down unexpectedly. When asked why, many gave polite answers: new season, family commitments. But insiders hinted at something deeper: exhaustion, disillusionment, and growing frustration with what they described as celebrity-style leadership. Rumors circulated that decisions were being made less by prayer and more by strategy, that meetings sounded more like corporate boardrooms than spiritual gatherings. Words like profit, influence, and brand replaced faith, service, and calling. Then came the first major wave of unease: murmurs about the church's finances. Reports began to surface that Bishop Ellis was taking extravagant trips, staying in luxury hotels, and traveling on the church's dime. While these claims were never officially proven, the perception alone began to create division. Members wanted transparency, and when they didn't get it, trust began to erode, even more heartbreaking. Some of the church's oldest members, those who had prayed, tithed, and built greater grace brick by brick, started leaving. Some slipped away quietly. Others confronted Bishop Ellis directly, urging him to return to the old ways of humility and servanthood that his father embodied. But their pleas went unheard. Ellis, confident in his calling and convinced he was modernizing the ministry, pressed forward. Bigger productions, more televised services, a stronger social media presence. To the public, everything still looked perfect. The lights, the sound, the spectacle, all flawless. But behind that perfection, something sacred was cracking, because while the world saw a bishop walking in glory, those closest to him were starting to see something else: a man standing on the edge of a fall. And soon, that fall would come in front of the entire world, live, on stage, during one of the most watched funerals in modern history. If there was ever a single moment that brought Bishop Charles H. Ellis III into the harsh glare of the global spotlight, it happened not in a Sunday service, but during a funeral watched by millions. The year was 2018, and the world had gathered to honor the legendary Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin. It was supposed to be a celebration of faith, culture, and music, a moment of unity and reverence. But what unfolded on that stage would instead become one of the most uncomfortable viral moments in modern church history. When pop star Ariana Grande stepped to the pulpit to sing her rendition of "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman," the crowd rose in applause. Cameras zoomed in. The moment was tender, moving, and filled with emotion. But seconds later, it turned into something entirely different. As Ariana finished performing, Bishop Ellis greeted her, but his gesture quickly crossed a line that millions watching would not ignore. With his arm wrapped around her, cameras captured his hand positioned uncomfortably, high along her torso, near her chest, while she visibly shifted and tried to pull away. The uneasy smile on Ariana's face told the world everything it needed to know. Within minutes, the clip spread across social media. By nightfall, it was everywhere. Twitter erupted. Hashtags like "Jutes Respect Ariana" and "Church2" trended worldwide. Instagram flooded with slow-motion replays, comments, and condemnation. Some said it was a misunderstanding. Others called it an example of how unchecked power in the pulpit can blur the boundaries between authority and accountability. And instead of calming the outrage, Bishop Ellis's response made it worse. In a backstage interview, he tried to brush the moment off, joking that he thought Ariana Grande was a new item on the Taco Bell menu. That comment, tone-deaf, dismissive, and culturally insensitive, poured gasoline on an already burning fire. Critics accused him not just of inappropriate behavior, but of mocking the situation entirely. The backlash came fast. Women's rights advocates called for an apology. Prominent pastors and Christian leaders expressed shock. Even Aretha Franklin's fans, who came to celebrate her life, were stunned that such an incident had occurred in a sacred setting. Eventually, under mounting pressure, Bishop Ellis issued a public apology. But even then, his words felt hesitant. "It would never be my intention to touch any woman's breast. Maybe I crossed the border. Maybe I was too friendly or familiar." That phrase, "maybe I crossed the border," echoed through the media like a hollow bell. It wasn't firm. It wasn't remorseful. It sounded like avoidance. For many, the damage was already done. Within his own church, young women began to question their comfort level. Parents wondered about boundaries. Ministers whispered behind closed doors, uneasy about the new scrutiny the church now faced. Bishop Ellis's once flawless reputation, the man who stood as a national spiritual figure, now had a permanent blemish. But what the world didn't know then was that this wasn't the first time his actions had raised concerns, because while the Ariana Grande incident exposed something to the public, those inside Greater Grace Temple had been struggling with their own private truths for years. And when the walls finally came down, the testimonies that emerged would be far more disturbing than anything the cameras caught that day. The Ariana Grande incident might have shocked the public, but for many inside Greater Grace Temple, it felt like something they had seen coming for a long time. It was as if the world had finally caught a glimpse of what they had been whispering about behind closed doors, a side of Bishop Ellis few dared to speak of out loud. In the months that followed the scandal, quiet whispers became full-blown stories. Former church members, ministry staff, and volunteers began speaking up, first anonymously, then publicly. What emerged wasn't just a tale of one misjudged moment, but a pattern that painted a much darker picture of spiritual manipulation and blurred boundaries. It started on social media. A post appeared from a woman known only by her initials, KS, a former congregant who had served under Ellis for years. Her message, long and emotional, quickly went viral in Detroit's gospel community. She wrote, "You start off thinking you're getting spiritual guidance, but it slowly turns into something else. You're complimented on how you dress, on how your body looks. If you pull away, you're told you're being too sensitive or not spiritually mature. It messes with your mind until you start to question yourself. And then you see it happening to others too." Her words struck a chord and opened a floodgate. Soon after, several former volunteers and assistant ministers began sharing their experiences through local blogs, online forums, and podcasts. The stories were eerily similar: prolonged hugs, inappropriate comments, personal questions during counseling sessions that crossed the line between spiritual mentorship and personal intrusion. One former choir member described being invited to what was supposed to be a private mentorship session with Bishop Ellis. The meeting began with prayer, but quickly shifted to personal questions about her dating life, her body, and her spiritual submission. She said she left the meeting feeling confused, uncomfortable, and powerless. She summed it up in one haunting line: "You don't say no to the bishop, not without consequences." But perhaps the most troubling part wasn't just the alleged behavior. It was the response when people tried to speak up. Multiple women claimed that when they approached church leadership to express discomfort, they were met with silence, blame, or even spiritual guilt. Some were told they were attacking God's anointed. Others were warned that speaking against the bishop was inviting curses upon themselves. That fear kept many quiet for years. Then came a revelation that sent shockwaves through the Detroit faith community, a leaked internal memo. Written by a former staff member, it allegedly revealed that Greater Grace Temple had received at least 2 formal complaints about Bishop Ellis's behavior long before the Ariana Grande scandal. According to the memo, both incidents were handled internally, with no public disclosure or investigation. Instead, the women were reportedly encouraged to pray for healing and restoration. For many, that memo confirmed what they already suspected: that a system designed to protect the ministry had instead protected the man leading it. As more testimonies surfaced, a Detroit-based podcast called Sanctified But Silenced released a multi-part series featuring emotional interviews with former Greater Grace members. These weren't vague accusations. They were detailed, date-specific, and painfully consistent. One guest said, "This isn't about tearing the church down. It's about saving it. Because if we stay quiet while people get hurt in God's name, we're no better than the ones doing it." By this point, the story was no longer about a single incident on stage with a pop star. It had become a mirror reflecting something deeper, an unchecked culture of power and silence within the church. And as those testimonies spread, one question began echoing louder than ever. How long had this been happening? And who allowed it to continue? Because behind every pulpit, there's a system. And in Bishop Ellis's case, that system was about to be tested like never before. What happened next would force even his strongest defenders to confront the truth, that the issue wasn't just about one man's downfall, but the cracks running through the very foundation of the modern church. As the pressure mounted and the testimonies piled up, Bishop Charles H. Ellis III finally broke his silence, not in a fiery sermon or through an emotional press conference, but through a carefully worded confession. He admitted to having what he described as an inappropriate relationship with a former congregant, a revelation that confirmed what many had long suspected. Yet even his admission felt guarded, more like damage control than repentance. The Pentecostal Assemblies of the World, PAW, the denomination Ellis once presided over, released a formal statement acknowledging the situation and announcing a review process. But many in the church community viewed it as too little, too late. For years, allegations had circulated quietly, and now that the truth had surfaced, it seemed like the leadership's priority was preservation, not accountability. Behind closed doors, discussions reportedly turned to damage management, protecting the brand, minimizing media exposure, and reassuring donors. Meanwhile, victims and former church members continued to speak out, demanding real change. The phrase "pray and move on" was no longer enough. Some of Ellis's followers defended him, claiming this was a witch hunt,